Greetings everyone. I'm doing a review of the Saitek X56 HOTAS. This is a newly released HOTAS. It is the refresh of the Saitek X55, and its primary new feature is a pair of analog mini sticks, which are popular with space sim enthusiasts, and this HOTAS is marketed primarily towards players of games like Elite Dangerous and Star Citizen. So I pre-ordered this from Amazon. It cost $250. Compared with $200 for the X55. My primary motivation is to play Elite Dangerous and to a lesser extent Star Citizen, but lately I've mostly been playing Elite Dangerous ever since I got my HTC Vive because it's a real blast to experience in VR, and I wanted to have a good HOTAS that would help with the immersion that the HMD provides, or at least not break the immersion. So let's start with the contents of the box. Now, the box itself is nothing fancy. It's just a basic packaging. Everything was in place securely and wrapped in plastic for protection. But I'm not going to put everything back in the box in order to do a fake unboxing video. I feel like that's a waste of time. So this is the contents. Over here we have the throttle. I've already plugged it into my computer. It is pre-assembled, so it comes as a single unit. Over here we have the stick, which comes as two pieces. You have the base and you have the stick itself, which will need to be threaded onto the base. We have a step unit. This is placed on the wrist rest of the stick if you want to raise your wrist position. It's good for someone who has a smaller hand. I would say it's about a centimeter thick. And we have a container of springs. So like the X55, this has the so-called feel spring system, which means that there are multiple springs provided that you can put onto the base, and that will allow you to customize the level of tension so you can have a lighter or a heavier feel on the stick. If we open this, you will see a blue spring, a yellow spring, and a red spring. The green spring comes pre-installed on the stick base. So you don't have to install a spring if you like the feel of the green spring, but if you want something different, then you could swap it out. In addition, you will find stickers, because maybe you love Saitek so much you want to put stickers everywhere that say Saitek on them. It's a little paper that just tells you to go download the drivers. And this quasi-manual tells you again, go download the drivers, tells you how to thread this on, and then says connect to the PC, of course. And on the other side, just a few highlights. But this is not really a proper manual. If you want a manual, you would have to go to Saitek's website to download it. Unfortunately, there actually is no manual. If you go to their website, you will find an X55 manual, but they don't seem to have released an updated manual for the X56. So the X55 manual more or less works for the X56. Obviously, there's a couple of differences, such as the analog sticks. Another interesting difference is if we look at these springs, we have the heaviest at red, going down to the lightest at blue. The specs on the springs are actually identical to the X55 springs, but strangely they did change the color coding. So on the X55, the red is actually the lightest spring. So that's a little strange. I don't know why they did that. So the first thing that you should do is, of course, put this together. Now in my case, I actually prefer a very light spring compared to the green one. I've tested the green and the blue pretty extensively, and I've used the red and the yellow briefly to test them out. And I personally like the feel of the blue. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this cap off. And the one kind of hiccup in this whole process is that this cap actually will snap on very tightly. And you have to pull it really hard to get it to come off. So hard that I thought I was going to break it the first time. Now I've actually already removed it and just sat it loosely on there so that I wouldn't have it pop off on video and I'd have to go run across the room to find it. But I do think that's a little unfortunate because it makes you feel like you want to change the spring once and just be done with it. Whereas I think if it were easier to take it on and off, you might want to actually use multiple springs depending on which game you're playing to get a custom feel. You might want to use a light spring for Star Citizen and then a heavy one for DCS World, for example. So once we've removed that, we're going to pull these retaining clips apart. And they're actually just two different pieces. I'll just hold the spring down in order to pull it out. There we go. So we have these two pieces that basically come together. They just snap in. And because of these little notches on the top and bottom, they can only go in with a certain orientation. And by the way, I made that look a lot harder than it is because I've got some sweaty hands right now. So we'll just take out this green spring, and I will put in the blue one. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to just slide that in. And then on the other side, I will push it in, and it should just lock together. Now, one thing that I suggest you do if you're going to test each of these springs is you can actually just thread this on without putting the cap back on. And that makes it a lot easier to swap the springs without having to keep pulling off that cap that's so hard to get off. And then you can put the cap back on once you've figured out which one you're comfortable with. But you can thread this on directly without the cap. I think the cap's only purpose is to hold the retaining clips together. But when you thread this on, this, I want to call it a bolt maybe, that would actually hold them together anyway. So I'm actually not even sure if you need the cap or if there's any benefit to the cap. And it actually might be nice to play without it because then you could easily swap out the springs. Like I said, I wish I could do. So I don't know if there's a reason that it's needed. If you have any ideas as to whether that's required, let me know in the comments. It'd be interesting to know. But in my case, I'm going to do this by the books. I'm going to put this back on. There we go. And we're done. We've got the spring on there. And then I'm going to put this on. Now, if you look at the base, you'll see there's a couple notches here that force it to go in the correct way. So there, it'll sit into place, and then I just thread this nut on for as far as it will go. And there we are. Now we have a stick with a nice light throw to it, much lighter than the green one. So for this whole process, the only thing that I want to call out is this little container. I actually think it would be nice if they had made this something reusable so that I could store the extra springs in it. The problem with doing that is I've taken out the blue spring, which is the smallest, and replaced it with the green, which is much bigger. And this container is only big enough for the 3 springs that originally were in it. Since the green is bigger than the blue, now the total length of each of these springs together is taller than the container, so I can't really put them back in. And the cap is something that was just taped on. You just kind of slide it on. And it had tape originally, which I removed. It would have been nice if this were a little bigger so that it could contain any combination of the springs, and the cap were threaded so it could just be a reusable container that you could keep well after you've set up your stick so that you could easily get to the other springs and swap them out. All right, so that summarizes the box contents. Okay guys, so we've got our stick and our throttle set up. Everything is plugged in. Now, before you use it, the first thing you're going to do, because you can't help it, is you're going to see it. So let's talk about the aesthetics of the HOTAS. So the shape of the throttle and the stick, if we look at them, they are identical to the X55 with the exception of the 2 analog sticks. It's a shape that I think is really good. It especially looks nice to me on the stick for something that's really aimed at a space sim enthusiast. I like this cutoff shape and everything. It looks futuristic without looking outlandish. So it looks pretty nice from that regard. The thing that I don't like about this is the paint job. This blue, this like neon blue, it's like a Tron blue. It really is not doing it for me, guys. And the design, along with the color being so Tronish, the whole thing kind of looks like the 80s vision of the future. And yeah, I think it kind of looks tacky. And if you look closely, you'll notice it looks really worn. So if you're a fan of like that Star Wars used future look, then you might like that. I don't really like it. When I first saw that, I thought maybe they screwed up the paint job or something, and I had to go look at the box again to see what it's supposed to look like and confirm, oh yeah, that's intentional. They didn't just like drag it behind a pickup to make it look like that. Yeah, not a fan of the paint job. You might like it. You know, aesthetics is always a personal thing. Personally, not my taste. I don't really mind that. You know, aesthetics in general is way down my list of priorities. I'm going to be playing this a lot in Elite Dangerous and VR, so I'm not even going to see it. But yeah, it's not my thing. You might like it. The next thing I want to talk about is the backlighting. So you can see there is backlighting behind these labels. The X55 had backlighting, and you were able to adjust the brightness. You could dim it if you liked. The X56 takes that a step further and adds RGB backlighting capability, so you can customize the color to your choosing, as well as still dimming it, of course. One thing that I'm not really a fan of, and I'm getting pretty nitpicky here, is there's a little bit of a difference between the throttle and the stick's backlighting style. So on the stick, you know, if you look at it straight on in daylight, like right now, you can't even see the backlighting at all. You kind of have to look pretty closely. If you look behind the hat switch, you can see it. So the three hat switches are where the backlighting is. And what the backlighting is doing, it is actually backlighting the switches. So you've got LEDs shining on the back of them, and the light reflects and diffuses off of that over this face here of the stick, that top face behind the hat switches. And it gives it a very soft, dim glow to it. And it's a very different style from what we have here on the throttle, where it's the labels that are backlit on the base of the throttle. Nothing on the throttle is backlit. But that gives it a very crisp backlighting style here. You know, it's the edges of the labeling are very exact. It's not kind of a glowing feeling that you get from it. So that's a little weird. I haven't heard anyone else comment on this, so that's just me being nitpicky. And it's my job as a reviewer to call out every little thing. I don't care in the slightest about that. You might, but no one else has said anything, so you probably don't. The other issue with backlighting is this. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the Mad Catz HUD software. So this is where you customize the colors. I'm going to do a full run through of the software later. So I'm just going to deal with the LEDs right now. So if I set this to say blue, you can see it changed to blue. So that's good. Then we'll change it to green. And now it's green. That's a very accurate green, by the way. The webcam does change it to kind of a teal color, but that's just the way that the color, the white balance on the webcam is acting. You know, we can do red, and there's red, and that looks appropriate. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to desaturate this a little bit. And if you look here on screen, those two reds, you know, it's showing the previous red and the new red. You know, if I move over here, you can see how the new red's the one on the right. They look pretty much the same to me. You know, if you look really closely, there's a slight difference, but they're basically identical. And I'm going to set this, and I want you to watch the LEDs. Yeah, so there's barely any difference on screen, but it turned to a pale pink on here. And it actually looks even more pale pink on the display to me than it does to you. So this is true across the entire color spectrum. Whenever you desaturate the colors, the effect on the LEDs themselves is greatly exaggerated compared to what you see on screen. Now you can still get the whole spectrum of colors, it's just that on screen you have to make your selection through a very small range. You can't really use this whole big color square. You kind of have to be stuck to the far right of it. So if you want something very pale pink, you're not going to use the pink section of the square. You're going to be really far over to the right. Again, that happens for pretty much every color. Let's change it back to red for a moment. Now, other than that, it's mostly okay until you try to deal with the warm colors. Red is fine, but they really put up a fight trying to show you yellow and orange. So let's show you yellow. Let's actually set it by hand, just so we get it exact. So there's a pure yellow. I'll set it. Now, it's kind of hard for you to tell, again, because of the color correction here. But to me, yeah, it kind of looks yellow on the screen, so maybe that's what you're seeing. But to me, it's a green. It's a yellowish green, but I would call this green, not a yellow. It's not a greenish yellow, it's a yellowish green. And the best way to demonstrate this to you guys, with the webcam changing the colors and all, is I'm going to show you behind the hat switches here where you're not seeing the LEDs through that filter of the clear display. You're going to see the light directly. That's green, guys. I can set it to orange. And now on here, again, everything looks a little paler to you. It actually looks more yellow now. It's kind of a greenish yellow, but it is more yellow. If you look here, it's still pretty green though. If I get really far down, so on screen it looks pretty much red. Well, now it looks kind of orange. Back here it looks like a proper yellow. If I go even further down, just a smidge away from red, it actually starts to look orange. So you get the full color spectrum here. It's not that you can't. It's just that it's so finicky to get it because what you see on screen does not match up to what you're actually getting. Now again, this is not really important to me. I did not even know this had RGB lighting when I ordered it. I didn't know it had backlighting at all, in fact. It's not something I care about. But if you are someone who actually does care about this, maybe you have an RGB backlit keyboard and you set it to orange because that's your color, you like flame orange, and you decided to get this because you're like, I'm going to match the colors on my HOTAS to my keyboard. Keep in mind, you can't just go into your keyboard app, copy and paste that RGB value and paste it in here, and get the exact same result. You're going to have to fuss around for a while to get it just right. So that's a little unfortunate. Again, it's nice that they have the RGB feature. I'm kind of annoyed that they were a little sloppy on the software side with getting that set. So that about does it for the aesthetics. For me, it's a very minor thing. I don't care much about the aesthetics. If you do, I just want you to see it for yourself and make your own decision. And that's about it. I'm going to move on to the hardware. All right, guys, so we get to the meat of this review, the hardware. So I'm going to start by going over, in general, the quality, the materials, and then I'm going to drill down into a step-by-step run-through of the buttons and the features, and then I will finish with a review of the axes of movement that it provides. So to begin with, if I put my hand on this stick, the feeling is superb. It feels really, really good in your hand. The throttle as well feels fantastic. The material here is a soft touch plastic, so it's kind of that rubberized feel. I don't think it's actually rubberized, it's just soft touch plastic, but it feels really good in your hand. It's got a slight tackiness to it. You know, if your hand gets sweaty, it's not going to be slipping all over the place while you're holding these things. But neither is it really super sticky like actual rubber might be. The movement of the stick is really good. Feels great, even crossing center, moving out of center. One thing that the X55 was criticized for is this piece down here under the spring. You can see it lifting up. And some people felt that that would cause some kind of resistance to moving out of the center as you, say, pulled back, or it might even be in just a single direction and not others. I've not felt that at all here, so if this X56 is representative of what we're going to be getting, then I would say that issue has been resolved. The gimbal is, of course, plastic. Some people criticize the X55 because they felt like the plastic was grinding, it's getting worn down. They might need to lubricate it very frequently. It feels buttery smooth to me. I've not had any issues so far that I could identify. So again, if this is representative of the X56, then I don't think that you're going to see that problem repeated. The bases, at first I wanted to say that they're kind of a medium weight. And I'm kind of comparing it to the CH Pro Throttle. The Pro Throttle is generally considered to be a very light throttle, but when I compare it, actually, they're about the same weight. So, I kind of remembered the throttle being lighter than I realized it was when I actually did a comparison of the two. In fact, the stick, at least, might be even a little lighter than the throttle. Now, with this blue spring, I've not had any issues with the base losing its position. With the green spring, when I push harder, I have had it lift up a bit. So depending on how you treat your stick, if you're someone who throws it all over the place, you might need to do something extra to secure it. The throttle, you should note, is a very heavy throttle. It's very different from this thing. It just slides back and forth freely. It's very unlikely, I think, that you can get away with not securing this somehow. Even on the lightest setting, depending on how you handle it, you might see it slip. On the heaviest setting, I can't imagine that you could get away with even something like industrial Velcro. You would probably have to bolt it down on the heaviest setting. I'll get into the throttle in a bit. But yeah, these are definitely not like, say, a Warthog where the base is so heavy that you don't have to do anything. They're really on the lighter side. Now, the X55 was criticized for the quality of its plastic construction. A lot of people felt that this would creak. Now, you can hear a little bit of noise, but that's just the gimbal moving around. There's no creaking at all anywhere on this. It feels absolutely solid. The stick body has no flex whatsoever. It's really, really good. The only flex I have found on the stick is on this wrist rest. If I go to a corner and I pinch, I can feel a little bit of flex between the top and the bottom. And that's really it. You won't feel that at all when you're actually playing the game because your wrist just rests on it. You don't actually pinch it. But yeah, this feels very, very solid. I found a couple spots where there's maybe a tiny, tiny, like hair thickness bit of flex on the base. But in general, this is very solid. There's no creaking, no flex, no bending. Definitely a very high quality product. And I think I should say at least a high quality material. Let's not judge the whole product yet. So let's take a look at the buttons now. I'm going to go one by one through the buttons, and I'll discuss the quality of each button, the ergonomics, and so forth. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a little utility. This is called, I believe it's Pointy's Joystick Tester. Now, for reasons that I will get into, you do not want to use the built-in Windows calibration tool testing window to see if your joystick is working. There's some things there that are very confusing with this stick, and I think some people are erroneously coming to the conclusion that they have defective sticks when they're actually acting as intended. I'll explain all that as I get to those points. So here we've got the stick. Of course, the first button is the trigger. That's button 1. Now this button has absolutely no play on it. It's very, very solid. This button is made of a kind of shiny, slippery plastic. It's definitely not as nice as the plastic on the body with its soft touch coating. All of the blue buttons that you see are made of that same plastic. But there's no play. There's a very solid stop when you bottom out the click there. Feels really good. It is a little soft in terms of the tactile feedback, which I understand is pretty common among Saitek products. So the click is not that loud, and the feeling of the tactile feedback is somewhat light. And that's just a taste thing. It's neither good or bad. The second button is the buttons usually used for missiles up here. It's raised fairly high, so you can get to it around the hat switches. Compared to the trigger, there's a fair amount of play on this one. And this is probably one of my, it's definitely not my favorite button, because when you rest your finger on it and move your finger around, you can definitely feel it moving. And some of these buttons, they have play when you're actually trying to find play, but when you're actually gaming, you wouldn't feel it. But this is one that you might actually feel. Feedback is okay. Not really especially good or especially bad. Sounds fine. Now the third button is on the side. Now this one also has a little bit of play, but not nearly as bad as the first one. And actually, I shouldn't say that first one was bad. It's actually not bad at all. It's just relatively worse than some of the others. This one has just a slight bit of play when you push it. Button 3 has a little more solid tactile feedback and more of a sound, a clicking sound to it than the last one did. That feels actually pretty good. It's a little concave, so your finger will find it naturally. Button C is actually the analog stick. So the analog stick can be pressed down. And it feels okay, except you'll notice those axes are so hard to keep straight while you actually push it. They're always going to go all over the place. So if you say we're using this for maneuvering thrusters as well as having a button assigned to it, every time you try to press that button, you're going to strafe left or right or something by accident. I would use this as either an analog function or a button, but probably not both. I will cover the axes of movement on this in a little more detail later. So for now, I'll just discuss that as a button, but it feels okay in terms of the click. It's just so hard to keep it straight while you use it. The next button is the pinky button down here. This one has no play at all. Feels very, very good. It's pretty much flat surface, nothing concave on this one. Nice loud click, nice feedback on it. This button I really like. Next one is the pinky flap. Of all the buttons on the stick and the throttle, this is easily my least favorite. And it's probably the only one that I would say I outright dislike. The problem with it is, one is the ergonomics. It's hard to reach. If you have a big hand, you might be able to reach it. I have to kind of stretch out. And secondly, there's no solid back to it. So most of these other buttons, you bottom out and it instantly stops. This one, there's the click, and I can keep flexing it. So Yeah, don't really like that one. I wish that felt more solid. It kind of feels like you're flexing it when you keep pulling back past the click. It makes it feel really cheap. Now, next up, we have the hat switches. We have two four-way hat switches. They're just regular hat switches. There's nothing really to comment about here. They are no better and no worse than I would expect. The second hat switch looks kind of like that F16 style. If you've used, say, CH products, you recognize that style. It's very good for very specifically picking up, down, left, or right, whereas this one's more of a just go in a direction and it'll round it off to up, down, left, or right. This one's very precise. I really like that kind of style. In fact, this one feels a little more ergonomic than, say, a CH1 with a similar design. And then we have our POV hat switch, 8 directions. The hat switch, I mean, I should have mentioned this in the aesthetics. I really hate this kind of faux metallic paint on plastic. They didn't do this on the X55. It was just black like the others, I believe. You can see it on the throttle as well for a couple of buttons and switches. I just think it looks terribly cheap. Even though it's no cheaper than these other hat switches, which are black, the black just looks better. It doesn't look as cheap or as toyish. The other thing I'll comment on is there is some left and right play, I mean rotationally. It's very subtle. There's a little bit on this one too, except when I turn this one, it feels like I'm kind of forcing it to turn against resistance, whereas on this one, it's more like it's freely turning. Like there's a certain very slight distance that it can just freely rotate without any resistance at all, like there's something loose. You know, there's definitely nothing loose there. It's just the way it's built, and it doesn't feel like it's going to break. You definitely don't feel it while you're using it, but you know, it definitely doesn't feel as solid as this one. There's nothing wrong with it per se. Okay, so we've done all of these buttons, and you'll notice there's still 3 buttons at the end there. We've got 15, 16, and 17. None of them are highlighted. Okay, guys, this is the deal with these buttons. I'm going to bring up this app. I'm going to switch it to raw input. Okay, so this app lets you pick raw input or DirectX input. Now you can see that 15 is highlighted. The Windows testing dialog shows raw input. It does not show the DirectX input. The DirectX input is what the game sees. And let me correct this a little bit so you can see the selection down there. So what you're seeing here with button 15 is something that you will never actually use in game. There is no button 15. There's no button 15, 16, or 17. These are virtual buttons. And again, on the DirectX, they are never used. These correspond to the mode switch on the throttle. 15 is mode 1, 16 is mode 2, 17 is mode S1, which is really mode 3. And the reason I suspect that these are here is because the stick and the throttle are both separate devices. If you want to program the stick, you're programming the stick separate from the throttle. You're setting the same profile on both of them, but each one is separately getting that profile. Since the profiles allow you to set different behaviors for each mode, if the stick is going to support modes, it needs to know what mode is on. These virtual buttons seem to be what tell the driver what mode is on. So the mode selector here behaves as a button which is held down. That's the raw input, so that's what the raw stuff does. If I switch it, there it goes. Even though this is a different device, it's the stick. But on DirectX mode, it's gone. You don't see it. You cannot use the mode selector as buttons in a game. I understand in the past you may have been able to do that, but the HUD software today doesn't appear to let you do that. So those buttons are there, they show up in the testing tool, and it will look like there's a defect because you're like, there's a button that's always on, and I can't even find the button. Something seems to be wrong here. It's not wrong. Everything is okay. That's what's supposed to happen. It's just your mode switch, okay? Don't worry about it, guys. Let's take a look at the throttle. Now here's another reason that I use this application rather than the Windows dialog. We have 35 buttons on this. Actually, it's 36, I believe. Yeah, so the Windows dialog for testing your gamepad will only show a maximum of 32. And here we have 36. So you will have some functionality that does not even show up. And you may be testing a button and you don't see anything happen and you'll think something's wrong. It's just that you can't see the button in that dialog. The button's actually working. You'll note that the buttons 34, 35, and 36 are actually the mode selector. The reason it didn't show up at first is just a bug in this application. You have to change it. So both devices, the stick and the throttle, both have 3 buttons devoted to showing the current mode, but that mode is set on the throttle, not on the stick. So let's go back to DirectX mode. So let's talk about the throttle now. So the base, of course, has the mode selector I just showed you. Switches between 3 modes. And by the way, the mode will always be highlighted in green. You cannot customize the color of that LED. It will always be green. We have a series of metal toggle switches, but they are not actually toggles, just like the X15, or X55, sorry. You press them up and let them go back to center, and that's a button press. You can see it there, button 6. Hold it down instead, and that's 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You can see each of them is labeled, switch 1, switch 2, switch 3, switch 4. Now oddly, once we get up here, they just label them toggle 4, 3, 2, and 1. And that might imply to you that there's something different about these, but there isn't. They're exactly the same. 1 button for up, 1 for down. And we have these dials, so you can see these dials let you set a range of values there, the S0 and S1. One thing I'll note is this upper dial feels really good. It's nice and smooth, like it's lubed up and has a nice bearing. The lower one's actually slightly not quite as good. It feels like there's some plastic rubbing there, like maybe it's not elevated off the base, and this one is. But it's a very nitpicky thing. It actually still works just fine. So on the throttle, let's move this up a bit. We have a button right here, simple button, button 1. We have our analog stick. If I press that down, that's button 32. Now, just like the one on the stick, this one is very hard to press down without also moving it around. In fact, it's significantly harder to press this one down without moving it. So again, I don't think you'd want to use this as a button and as an analog stick at the same time. We have 2 hat switches, slightly different designs, so you can feel which one your finger's on. 4-way. We have a slider. Now the slider is interesting, guys. It's button 33, which means if you're using the Windows testing app, you can't see it activated. So if you're using that app and you see nothing happen when you use the slider, it's not because something's broken. Maybe something is broken, but you can't tell from doing that. What's going on is it's just not showing up. The testing app will not show buttons over 32. Now, interestingly, I've also found that Elite Dangerous does not seem to pick up buttons over 32. So it will not pick this up. I can't directly bind to this slider. I can use the programming tool, the HUD software, to map this to say a keyboard key, and then I can use that keyboard key as the binding in Elite Dangerous, and it will work. I don't know yet. I have not tried Star Citizen to see if it has a similar limitation. People seem to dislike this slider. When I search for it, the X55 version, they seem to feel it's pretty useless. I actually find in Elite Dangerous, at least, it's super useful, mainly because the way it functions is you slide it on, and it's basically the same as holding down a button, even though you don't have to leave your fingers on it. And there's some functions in Elite Dangerous, like, say, Flight Assist, which you can use as, they call it hold mode. So you have to hold down the key to keep it on. And this works really well for that. So if you wanted to, say, flip Flight Assist off and then have to turn it back on with a toggle switch, another useful function to map to this is the forward-only mode throttle reverse. So if you're using forward-only mode on the throttle, which means this is 0, sorry, get that focus back, and this is full forward 100%, then what I could do is I could flip that on, and now my throttle is full reverse 100%, and go back to 0. So I find that very useful. Star Citizen doesn't seem to have these hold modes, so I don't know if it's going to be useful there. But for Elite Dangerous, this is pretty cool. We have a couple of dials on the throttle. And one of the nice things about these is they have a detent at 50%. And they also function as buttons, so you can press them down. They have a nice tactile feedback there. On the back of the throttle, we have a couple of buttons here. These buttons, they frankly kind of feel terrible. They're very mushy. You can see if I push the edge of this, let me see if I can get a good view. It doesn't really push down flat over the whole button. It kind of tilts towards the side I'm pushing. So that's a little disappointing. I'm not very happy with those. And we have a two-way switch here, so I can push it down or up. And then finally, we have this little wheel on the side. And this is a little weird. It's actually metal. I don't know why they made this metal. Like, if you're going to splurge on one metal button, why not make it, say, the trigger? But I think it's aluminum, just judging by the feel of the knurling. The knurling's actually really nice. Let's see if we can get a close-up. Yeah, it's not really showing very well. The way it works is there's just a bunch of detents, so you can just rotate it a little bit at a time. Click, 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 click. And every time you do that forward, it counts as a quick button press, and every time you do it back, it counts as a quick different button press. So you can see boom, 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 boom. So you can really rapidly press buttons by rolling through it. Which is interesting. I don't know what you would use that for. So yeah, the buttons on here, mostly okay, except I think these are the ones I really don't like, the ones on the back. I'll note that there's a few with some play. First of all of these toggle switches, they have a lot of play on them, so I can see if I can show you. Like side-to-side play. I mean, they feel like they're not going to break or anything. It's just something to note. And these wheels I'm not too fond of either. There's a little bit of play up and down for those too. But again, they feel pretty good in normal use. The only ones that I really don't like in normal use are the two back buttons. Now the throttle itself feels absolutely stellar, guys. I mean, this is just amazing. It feels so good. So good. And you know, I'm kind of holding it down with my other hand because it is a heavy throttle and I don't want this to pick up. If I move it quickly, yeah, I can make it move. But it's so smooth, so smooth. And it really feels like, with the level of resistance it has, that it's actually connected to some kind of machinery, like an engine or something. You know, it's not like this thing where you're just like... Yeah, so that feels nice. I like that. I like that a lot. In fact, spoiler alert, um, the one thing, if I had to pick one thing that really stands out positively about this, it's this throttle feel. It's really nice. And of course, we have this lock here, so I can separate them. Not really useful in a space sim. One thing I'll note is the play when they're together. There is a little. It's so little though. But one of the more interesting things is if I separate them and I move this back and forward. I don't know if you can see this. You'll note that moving the right side causes some slight play on the left one, and actually it's kind of going down more than going up, and it actually is gradually going down. Look at that. I can gradually make it shut. And on the left side, it has much less effect on the right than the right has on the left. But because of that, I don't know if this is really that great for a flight sim where you want to have separate engine control. It really works much better as a single throttle. Yeah, that play is kind of obnoxious, and it might loosen up a bit because it is still very heavy, having a new throttle. I hear that on the X55, these took some time to break in and they loosen up a bit. Right now I have this on the lightest setting. You can adjust the tension like this, and it gets much, much heavier. It goes a long way. So you can see you've got a huge range. And on the heaviest setting, oh man, I have to really hold this down to keep it from moving. It's just so heavy. The downside to this is, I really like this feeling on the lightest setting, but 90% of the available range of adjustment is so heavy I can't imagine anyone using it. It's just way too heavy. It really should be oriented more towards a lighter touch, so you should be able to adjust it lighter than the lightest setting pretty significantly, and then maybe only a little heavier. So it's oriented way too heavy. You would definitely have to secure this down at even the lightest setting. I think it'd be pretty tough. You might be able to get away with it on the lightest setting, but it'd be a little difficult. So all right, that's the buttons. Let's take a look at the axes real quick. And I'm going to switch applications here. So those of you who use the Star Citizen joystick mapper may recognize this. So the purpose of this is to show you some raw data about the joysticks. So you can see the way that they do this here is they use a scale from -1000 to +1000. And that will, it gives you a pretty accurate, high precision way of mapping any margin for error on this. The stick itself, as well as I think the throttle, are 16-bit on the X56. So the precision is much, much greater than just a range of 2000. But this is more than precise enough to tell us whether these things return to zero well, and how accurate they are. So you can see right now I'm not touching it, and it's hovering at around 8 or 9 on the x-axis and the y-axis. So that amounts to about 0.5% of the total range. And depending on how you calibrate it, it might hover at 0, but then maybe it might be a little higher, a little lower. The more tension on the spring there is, the better it returns to 0. So if I really try to push it over and release gently, I can get higher numbers, especially on the right side. You can see I can get it up to 24, but I can only really do that with the blue spring. If I have the green spring, I actually can't get it to sit anywhere above, say, 4. So depending on which spring you use, it may be more or less accurate. You're kind of making a trade-off between your ability to move it very lightly and the accuracy of the joystick if you let go. As for the rotational z-axis, you can see I'm moving it around. I don't see any effect on it, so you can move it pretty independently from that. The rotational z-axis on this is much stiffer than the movement on x and y, so you can adjust the tension on the spring for the x and y axes, but there's no adjustment for z, and it stays fairly tense. Now, on the z-axis, I don't think I've ever gotten it to return to anything other than perfect dead zero. If I return to the right, I can get it usually around 10 if I'm doing it just right. So, you know, a 10 would amount to 1% of the total right range and 0.5% of the total range left and right. Depending on how you calibrate this, that could amount to, say, -5 returning from the left and +5 returning from the right. But overall, everything here looks well within reason. One thing I've noticed sometimes is you can see that Y rotation. That's the analog stick. If I move this around really hard, you do get a little bit of movement on it, but it's yeah, it's not bad. If I move this around, you can see that's the X rotation, Y rotation. And mostly I think it was the upper right. There we go. So I can get it a little bit off. There's the biggest right there. So you can see about 50 on the Y. That's if I go to the lower right quadrant. And nothing really, just a hair if I go to the upper left. So that's actually, I think, the biggest deviation from zero I've seen on any of the axes, around 50 on the stick. So, you know, that's not great. It corresponds to, you know, if you were in the calibration window, it would show about 47%. Everything else I've tested in that calibration window would show 49 to 51% when it zeroes out, except that one. And, you know, that's not great. Honestly, I wasn't expecting a lot from the stick because it has such a you know, small movement in absolute terms, which means even the slightest movement in absolute terms is a big movement in relative terms, which is going to make it pretty hard to test. You know, to put this into perspective, I'm going to bring up our CH Pro throttle here, and I can move this stick around. Let's move it up and release gradually. Look at where that stays, guy. 391. That's 39% of its upward range that it's missing. I mean, you'd have to cut off that much in a dead zone to make this usable. And I don't want to say that it's okay that it's not perfect on this, just because it's even worse on another. But I just want to put that into perspective. That 50 range is just about, let me move this back. It's just about the minimum that I can move this if I try to move it precisely. So you could dead zone that out, and I don't think you'd feel any effect. But there's a big catch to that, and I'm going to get to that in a little bit. Basically, being off on this stick is a bigger deal than you might think. So moving on to the throttle. And we can move the throttle back and forth. I do wish there was a detent at 50%. That would make this much more useful for a space sim, so that you could make this a single forward and reverse throttle. So I can't really test the detent because there's no detent to test. Now you'll note the Z rotation there says 9. I believe that's this one. This returns to 9 every time. So the detent is not really at 0. It's about 0.5% off, which is not bad. Now one thing that's interesting, let's see if I can get that again. Now it's hard on that one. Let's use this one. So this one also, you see, is at 9, but it also keeps jumping to 1. So that's an interval of 8. All the other axes on here, other than the dials, go in increments of 1, and that's because their precision is greater than the precision of the SC joystick mapper. It goes from -1000 to 1000, and the joystick is 16-bit. But a jump of 8 is exactly what you would expect if you were mapping an 8-bit axis to a range of 2000. So it appears that these dials are actually going to be 8-bit, so they have 256 points that can be detected, not the far more that you get from the rest of the axes. The issue I have with this is just that there's no way to calibrate it away, even though it's consistent, because they are labeled Z, and since they're Z, you don't really test the middle. You calibrate it from the bottom and the top. So there's no way you could really be precise enough in doing that to get that to 0, but it's pretty much close enough. Now here, these are really good at returning to 0 on this little analog stick. They get very close every time. So that's really good. In general, the throttle analog stick is a lot better than the analog stick on the stick itself. This stick, it actually has a kind of a weird axis on it. So it's not exactly what you want to naturally do with your thumb. So at first when you use it, you're always going to be kind of rotated like 20, 25 degrees away from what you're trying to do. It's really irritating. And I was actually planning to give a pretty scathing comment on this in the review, but what I found is over the last couple of days as I've prepared for the review is I've started to finally learn it, and I'm getting much more accurate. But nevertheless, it's a lot harder to use this, especially if you throw in rotation and the movement of your hand, so your hand position's constantly changing. You really want to use this one as your maneuvering thruster. It's definitely a much better stick. And not to mention that at least on my unit, it's the more accurate of the two. Now, before I move on, I want to talk a bit about the ergonomics here. Let me take this away. So I find that this is really good if you have big hands, but I don't. I have average-sized hands. It's really hard for me to reach up here. I have to lift my hand up off the wrist rest. Thankfully, we have this riser that we mentioned back at the beginning, and it clips on pretty easily, just like that. And it's only about a centimeter of difference. But I find it really improves things. I can now use these much more easily. And one way that it helps is I'm less inclined to put my thumb here. And the problem with that, the problem with having your thumb here is that when you rest it, you rest your thumb against this right side of the joystick, at least I do. And then when you want to use this stick, you can't move it to the right because your thumb's already as far to the right as it can go. So if you use it more up here and then you bring it down here when you need to, you bring it exactly to the right spot so that you can use the stick optimally. And I find that this also greatly improved my accuracy on the axes here. At first it seemed like they were really weird. Once I added this, it greatly improved my ability to use it. It's still not perfect. I don't think they're quite right in the axis still, but it's better. It's definitely much better. I can probably use it accurately maybe 85% of the time now, and I'm still getting a little better. But in general, I don't really use this. Some people say, why would you have a second analog stick? I can kind of see why you want one for something like, say, a free head look. It would be a lot nicer than using, say, an 8-way POV switch, which is digital. In Elite Dangerous, at least, I don't care about that because I'm using a VR HMD. But for something like Star Citizen, or the vast majority of people who are playing Elite Dangerous who are not playing it in VR, it's kind of useful. And yeah, so this really improves the ergonomics. I just wish, if there's one nitpick, that we had a second step unit that was included, one that was maybe about 2 centimeters tall, because this just barely makes this usable for my hand, and I have medium-sized hands. If you have small hands, if you're a child or a woman or just a guy with small hands, this may not be enough for you. And it would have helped make this much more universally accessible if they had a second adjustment riser. So all right, that's the summary of the hardware. overall, I have to say I'm actually very happy with this hardware. There's a couple of things that stand out negatively, mainly um, this little switch here and the buttons on the back of the throttle. Those are kind of the two things that I don't like. But I really do like the stick itself, and its movement is very good. And the throttle especially feels phenomenal. I know some people who had trouble with their X55, they got rid of the stick, but they kept the throttle, and I can get why. It really, really feels great. So all right, that's it for the hardware, guys. Let's move on to the next step. Okay, guys, let's talk the software now. So before I get into the HUD software, which is how you program these the HOTAS, I want to discuss the drivers real fast. I know a lot of the negative reviews I've seen for the X55 related to it lacking Windows 10 drivers. Thankfully, the X56 does, at time of launch, have Windows 10 drivers, and they more or less work fine. However, I did run into a little hiccup with the driver installer. It seems that if you have plugged in the devices already when you run the installer, it will get stuck at the point where it's supposed to be installing the drivers. And so the trick is run the drivers before you ever plug in the devices. And when you get to that step and it tells you to plug them in, that should be the first time that you plug them in. That's kind of odd. I don't know why that happens, and it's kind of a bad first impression when that happens. But if you do get stuck in that situation, you can install the drivers by hand. Just find the INF file in the temporary directory where the installer extracts it and do it by hand. So on to the HUD software. It's basically the same as the X55 software, just with some rebranding. If we go to the programming, you can see we can program the stick or the throttle. The functionality here, I'm not really going to go into any detail on. It's pretty much the same as what you can do with other manufacturer software. You can change buttons into latch mode, which means you press them once to make it like holding down the button and press it a second time to release. I can assign macros that include keyboard or even mouse actions. And you can even disable actions entirely. We can change the mode here, say mode 1 and mode 2. Mode 3, and that will allow you to just use that mode switch on the throttle to quickly switch between the behavior of your stick or throttle. Once you've made your changes, you actually have to click this button up here, and that will cause it to take effect. Going on to settings, you'll note that the LED brightness, this was in the X55 just a simple progress bar that you could use to select what level. It still says LED brightness, strangely, even though it's not brightness anymore. It's actually color and brightness. Now, let's go to the settings. You'll see that we can adjust things like the dead zone and the curvature. That's all the standard stuff that you'd expect. You'd also be able to see the details on the springs, unlike the X55 manual, which you would have to use since there's no X56 manual. These are actually correct for the new color coding. So guys, what is missing here? Can you see it? Where is my rotational X and Y axis that represents the analog stick? It's not here. Saitek, this is not an X55 anymore. You have new features. You have to support them in the software. So you'll remember that I said that being a little off on the analog stick is actually kind of a big deal. This is why I can't set a dead zone to get rid of it. So if you set that to maneuvering thrusters and you've got something that's only returning to 47%, you're going to constantly have your thrusters on. There's just no way to get out of that. Elite Dangerous does let you set dead zones in the game itself. So in Elite Dangerous, that you have got to work around. For something like Star Citizen, I don't think it has that feature, so you're kind of screwed. Saitek, you got to fix this. Put out an update, add that. On the throttle, same thing. Nothing for the analog stick. That's a problem. We got to get this. if I have to call out one major issue with this stick, it's this. You've got to have that support. And it'd be so trivial to add. I don't know why it's not there. Lastly, I just want to, again, remind you, there's no manual. You click it, nothing happens. You've got to go get the X55 manual. It's the closest thing that you've got to it. So in general, on the software side, all the core programming support's there. Unfortunately, it really feels like with both the manual and the software that they haven't really updated everything for the X56 at this point. They really need to get on that. And I think it's really sloppy of Saitek to have released this without getting their ducks in a row, getting this software proper. It's basically rebranded X55 software. It's not X56 software. That's the problem. The last note that I want to make is because this is a new stick, it's not necessarily going to be automatically picked up. When I played Elite Dangerous, it did not automatically detect this. If you have an X55, it gets picked up automatically. It switches on that preset. The way that I worked around this is I've got that X55 bind file, copied it into my personal directory for binding so that it would show up. And I did a search and replace inside that file, basically replacing the predefined values that they use for X55, which is Saitek X55 stick and Saitek X55 throttle, with the actual device ID. And if you need the device ID, just create an initial test binding and just set a couple things to something on the throttle, something on the stick, and then look at it in your text editor, and you'll get those IDs. And that will give you an X55 preset that works for your X56. And from there, you can make subsequent adjustments much easier than starting from scratch, because as you know, Elite Dangerous has a huge number of controls. So that's the summary of the software. And we'll move on to the next section, the review. Okay, guys, so that's pretty much everything on the hardware and the software side. So now it's time to just go over some conclusions. But first, I want to make some comments on reliability and durability. You can't talk about a Saitek product, especially one which follows the X55, without discussing that. The X55 became a bit notorious for having quality control problems. It's not that the X55 is necessarily a bad HOTAS, it's that people were getting X55s that were not doing what it was designed to do. And it looks from my research that the vast majority of the problems that people who had problems experienced were button failures, especially with the hat switches. You see a lot of complaints about the hat switches. So they would stop working. They'd either not work right out of the box, or they'd stop working after a pretty short period of time, maybe just a few weeks or a few months. The other complaints that you will see that people cite is the possibility of the throttle failing, saying that the wires get beat up in the throttle and eventually fail, and ghosting issues. Now, I think that Saitek, they've earned their reputation because of the button problems, but I think they also get a worse rap than they deserve. They kind of deserved a bad rap, but not as bad as they got. When I went looking for example, for the instances where people had wire failures in their throttles, it's people talk about all the time when they list the problems Saitek has. That's one of the things they'll say that the X55 had. But I found very, very few instances of that. I found maybe 3 or 4 reviews or comments from people saying that theirs broke. And the fact that it happened in multiple people in the same way means it's certainly not a coincidence. But that's a pretty small number of people out of the many thousands of X55s that I assume thousands that shipped. And by and large, if you look at the Amazon reviews, 70% of people who bought one, or who reviewed one, I should say, gave it a 4 or a 5-star review. With any product, there's going to be a certain number of failures which are normal. The CH Pro Throttle is a very well-respected product. It's considered a high-quality product and a very reliable one. I just showed you my analog stick on mine being completely non-functional. That doesn't prove anything. It doesn't mean it's a bad product. mine may just be defective, and even a good manufacturer like CH will not produce 100% flawless products. But what happens is when you have a systemic problem, like the button failures were on the X55, all problems become systemic. Any little thing that happens, the stuff that we would normally say, oh, that's just a tiny number of people, that's just normal failures, suddenly get lumped in with the systemic ones. I don't think that the throttle failures were a systemic problem. I don't feel frightened that my throttle is going to fail like that. It doesn't mean it won't, but I don't think from the X55 history that there's a reason to think that it's going to fail any more than ACH Pro Throttle is going to fail, even though mine, in a manner of speaking, is failed. Yeah, there are more people who have had stuck analog sticks on the CH Pro Throttle than I have seen have failures of the wiring in the Saitek X55 throttle. But it's still a good product, and we know that CH is a good company because it's a small number of people. But if, say, CH suddenly had a whole bunch of other issues with, say, buttons failing, we might suddenly say, oh, they have problems with button failures and the analog stick getting stuck. So I think the root of the problem here is really the button failures. That's the thing that you need to worry about with the X55. And based on the fact that this is just a continuation of the X55, you may want to worry about that with the X56 as well. The ghosting problem, I'm also not worried about because it seems pretty definitive at this point that that is a problem not with the Saitek hardware. That is a problem with motherboards not providing sufficient power through their USB hub controllers. Saitek can't control that. It is a USB certified device, which means that the throttle and the stick are both, at least independently, individually, using less than the 5 unit loads of power, the 500 milliamps of power that they are allowed to use as peripherals. So if they do that, fine, or they would not be USB certified. So that's not their fault. And you can get around that, is pretty well known now, using an external USB hub, which is externally powered. So if that were to happen to me, and I've not experienced any ghosting, by the way, I know how to get around it. I don't expect the throttle to fail. It's not impossible that it would, but I don't think it's more likely that this throttle will fail than another manufacturer's throttle failing. And different throttles may fail in different ways, and they have their way that it might fail. I just don't think that it's likely. So that leaves the button issue. Obviously, my buttons work great out of the box. I haven't had any problems with them. As for axes returning to zero, we saw it's not absolutely perfect. I certainly wish it were better with the light spring. It's really good on the stick with the more tense springs. The analog stick on the stick with on the joystick was not perfect, but it's not terrible. Will they fail over time? I obviously can't say. So what I'm really getting at is, one, I want to separate the systemic problems, the pathological problems where Saitek in the past has stood out as especially bad versus the normal low levels of badness that everyone has. And, I want to kind of take reliability off the table. I don't want to hand wave it away, but it's just I can't grade this on reliability because I haven't had it long enough. It's just a first impression review. So all I can do is I can tell you what I think about the stuff I've talked about, the aesthetics, the ergonomics, the functionality, the feeling, the software. And I can tell you that overall, it is absolutely not a home run as a product, but I would call it a triple with a run batted in. It's a solid product. It's kind of the only product like it at this price point. For the same price, you could get a CH Pro Throttle and a CH Fighter Stick. I honestly think this is better than those two. You can disagree. A lot of people really like the CH products. I don't like the feel of them. It's one of the reasons I'm getting this and not keeping my throttle. I just don't like that plasticky feeling. I think it's a good product overall, and I'm not going to give it a buy recommendation though because I don't know about the reliability yet, and I think people who are more risk averse may want to hold off, watch the people who are buying one, see what they say. I'd love to hear feedback in the comments if you're getting an X56. Maybe run some of the same tests that I am, see what you get. It'd be good to see that. Let people decide if they're going to buy one after we get more numbers. You have to have numbers to really know. So yeah, overall, hardware pretty good. Couple of flaws, just a couple of buttons that weren't that great. The analog stick's less than perfect in its position. The software is kind of where I think it really needs some work. Mad Catz really needs to get on that and update the software so it's proper X56 software, not just X55. And the last thing I want to note too is the value. You know, this costs $250. Is it worth $250? I'm going to say no. I hate to say it. It's just that the X55 costs $200, and do the changes they have made to this really warrant another $50? Not really. I mean, the analog stick doesn't add $50 to it, right? The RGB lighting, I can't imagine that adds $50. I don't even care about the RGB lighting. I think it's a $200 HOTAS, but I think Saitek's kind of banking on the fact that there's nothing else really quite like this at this price point. So if you really want something like this, you don't have any competition, so you've got to pay it. And I'm not disappointed in the product at all for $250. I just think that's not the best price point. And if there were more competition, I don't think they could get away with that price. If you compare it to the CH HOTAS, a fighter stick, and a Pro Throttle, which would cost new off of Amazon about the same as this, it looks better in my opinion because it has more functionality than the CH Pro Throttle and the fighter stick, assuming of course that it turns out to be reliable. The CH products, you understand when you buy one that you're pretty likely to get a good one, and it's still kind of up in the air whether this is going to be the same way. All right, so this turned out to be a much longer review than I thought. If you stuck with it the whole way, you're a trooper. Thanks a lot. Let me know what you think below. I'm going to say good product, I like it, but let's wait for the long-term reviews before we make a final verdict. Thanks a lot, guys.